She found the badge on her desk at 5:42 in the morning. No letter, no explanation. Just cold metal and 6 handwritten words on a folded note. I'm sorry. I have to go. Corinne Ashcombe, 30 years old, CEO of a technology empire worth $11 billion, stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor and read those words 3 times. Her coffee went cold. Outside, the city was still dark. She had never once spoken to her night janitor. Not really. She knew his name because HR knew his name, Brenner Holt. 37. Single father. 3 years without a single disciplinary note, a single complaint, a single absence that wasn't covered. And now he was gone. She should have moved on. She had a board meeting at 9, a product launch in 2 weeks, and a daughter in a hospital across town who hadn't smiled at her in 4 months. But something about those 6 words wouldn't leave her alone. By the time security pulled the footage and showed her where Brenner went every morning after his shift ended straight to Westbridge Children's Hospital, pediatric floor, room 14B, Corinne's hands had gone still on her desk. Room 14B, that was Hadley's room. If you've ever felt like you were doing everything right and still somehow failing the person who needed you most, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story to the end, because what happens next will change the way you think about strength, sacrifice, and the people we overlook every single day. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me tell you everything. Corinne had built her company on the principle that information was power. She trusted data. She trusted process. She trusted the systems she had constructed over a decade of 70-hour weeks and decisions that kept her awake until 3 in the morning. What she had never trusted, not entirely, was instinct. But standing in the elevator of Westbridge Children's Hospital at 6:15 on a Monday morning, still wearing her coat, her access badge clipped to her lapel out of pure habit, she was running entirely on instinct. She had told her driver to wait. She had told her assistant nothing. She had walked through the lobby and past the reception desk with the quiet authority of someone who belonged everywhere, which was the first skill Corinne had ever deliberately cultivated, long before the money came. The pediatric floor smelled like antiseptic and artificial orange from the hand sanitizer dispensers, mounted every 20 feet along the corridor. The lights were the pale fluorescent kind that made everyone look slightly unwell. A nurse pushing a medication cart glanced up at her and then back down, uninterested. Corinne slowed as she approached the turn in the hallway. Room 14B was at the end. She had walked this corridor 53 times over the past 4 months. She knew the scuff mark on the baseboard near the water fountain. She knew which floor tile squeaked. She knew the name of every nurse on the morning rotation. What she didn't know, what she had somehow never known, was what happened in room 14B before she arrived each morning at 9. She stopped just outside the door. It was open 3 inches. She didn't push it wider. Through the gap, she could see the foot of Hadley's bed. Her daughter's small feet beneath the hospital blanket, the left one in the soft brace that supported the ankle she'd stopped using properly after the illness had taken so much from her. And beyond the bed, in the chair that Corinne usually occupied, was a man. He was big, wide through the shoulders, the kind of build that doesn't come from a gym, but from years of carrying things heavier than weights. His dark jacket was the kind you bought for $20 at a discount store. His hands were folded in his lap. He was talking, not performing, not reading from a rehabilitation script, just talking in a low, even voice, the way you talk to someone when you're not trying to get anything from them. So Maisie decided the best place to put the birdhouse was directly outside my bedroom window, he was saying, which seemed fine until the first bird moved in at 4:30 in the morning and apparently had strong opinions about the sunrise. A sound came from the bed. Corinne went completely still. It was laughter. Small, a little rough from disuse, the kind of laugh that costs something to produce when you haven't used it in a while. But it was real. It was Hadley's laugh, the one Corinne hadn't heard since before the diagnosis, before the hospital, before everything in their lives had narrowed down to treatment schedules and progress reports and the careful, exhausting optimism of specialists who were paid to stay positive. Was it loud? Hadley asked. Hadley. Brenner's voice was patient and amused. It sounded like someone was operating heavy machinery directly above my face. I considered filing a noise complaint against a bird. The bird had a beak and no sympathy. I felt a complaint was warranted. Another laugh, shorter this time, but followed by something Corinne had been trying to coax out of her daughter for months. The sound of Hadley shifting in bed, moving voluntarily, reaching for something. Can you hand me the water? Hadley asked.
Sure.
Corinne heard the soft scrape of the cup being passed. She heard Hadley drink. She heard her settle back against the pillow. Tell me about the other bird, Hadley said. I told you about the other bird last Wednesday. I know. Tell me again. Corinne's back was against the corridor wall. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she rarely was. She had stood in boardrooms with 100 people waiting for her to speak. She had delivered earnings reports that moved markets. She had fired a COO in front of witnesses and not flinched. She could not make herself open that door. 3 years ago, Brenner Holt had applied for the night maintenance position at Ashcombe Technology through a temp staffing agency that didn't ask many questions and didn't pay much attention to gaps in employment history. The application listed previous work as security consulting. It didn't mention the Navy. It didn't mention the 8 years he'd spent doing things that weren't listed on any publicly accessible document. Brenner hadn't lied. He'd just been selective, which was a skill the Navy had also taught him. He got the job because he showed up to the interview on time, answered questions without rambling, and didn't complain about the overnight hours. The facilities manager had shaken his hand and said, "You start Monday." That had been enough. The work itself was honest and quiet and required exactly the amount of his attention he could spare. The rest he kept for Maisie. Maisie was 8 years old, and the single best thing that had ever happened to him, which he recognized was exactly the kind of thing fathers said, but in his case he believed it without qualification. She was sharp and funny and stubborn in ways that reminded him of her mother, and she had learned very young how to read his silences, which ones meant "give me a minute" and which ones meant "I'm fine. I promise. Come here anyway." After her mother died a car accident, 3 years ago, 17 days before Christmas, Maisie had started sleeping with the light on. She didn't ask to. She just stopped turning it off. Brenner had never mentioned it. He just started leaving the hallway light on too, so she wouldn't feel like she was the only one. That was the thing about grief. It didn't respond well to strategies. You couldn't set objectives for it or measure progress against a baseline. You just had to be in the same room with it long enough that it stopped feeling quite so impossible to carry. He'd learned that the hard way. And he'd learned it alone, mostly in the specific way that single fathers learn things at 2 in the morning, with a sleeping child down the hall and no one to ask whether they were doing it right. So when he first encountered Hadley, when he turned the corner in the hospital's east corridor at 5:48 on a Thursday morning, with a mop and a supply cart, and found a small girl sitting on the floor outside a therapy room, knees pulled to her chest, crying in the particular silent way of a child who has learned that crying loudly doesn't bring the people they want, he didn't call a nurse. He didn't ask her name, or her room number, or whether she was supposed to be there. He sat down on the floor 6 feet away from her, with his back against the wall, and waited. That was it. He didn't say anything. He just stopped moving, the way you stop moving around an animal that's afraid, and he let the silence be what it needed to be. After 4 minutes, Hadley said, without looking at him, "I hate the therapy." Brenner said, "Okay, it hurts and it doesn't work, and they keep saying it's going to get better, but it's been 3 months. That's a long time. Everyone keeps telling me to try harder." She finally looked at him. Her face was red from crying, and there were shadows under her eyes like she hadn't slept well in weeks. "I am trying." Brenner looked at her steadily. "I believe you." That was all. But something about the way he said it, without the careful hopefulness that adults usually packaged their reassurances in, without the slight uptick at the end of the sentence that turned a statement into a question, made Hadley stop crying. She stared at him. "You're a janitor." "Yeah." "Why are you here so early?" "Night shift." "Do you like it?" Brenner considered the question with more seriousness than most adults would have bothered to. "I like that it's quiet," he said finally. "And I like that I know what I'm supposed to do every night before I get there. It's a good job for someone who needs to know what's coming." Hadley pulled at the hem of her hospital socks. "I used to know what was coming. Before you got sick? I had plans," she said, "for the summer. And school. And there was going to be this project about—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters," Brenner said. "It just got postponed." She looked at him sideways. "How do you know?" "I don't," he said honestly. "But postponed is usually more accurate than over. In my experience." She seemed to turn this over. Outside, the early morning hospital sounds continued. A cart somewhere, a door, a PA announcement 2 floors up. "I'm Hadley," she said, Brenner. "That's a weird name." "Yeah," he agreed. "It is." He came back the next morning. Not because he had decided to, exactly more because the shift ended, and he had 40 minutes before he needed to be home, and he found himself walking toward the east corridor without having consciously chosen to. Hadley was in her room by then, awake early the way sick children often were, and she looked up when his shadow crossed the doorway. "I thought you'd be gone," she said. "Shift ends at 6:15, he said. "I have time." He sat in the chair. He didn't bring anything, no books or toys or activities, because he didn't want to make the visits feel like an agenda. He just talked. About Maisie and the birdhouse and the ridiculously complicated opinions their cat had developed about breakfast timing. About a mop wheel that had broken in a way he found genuinely impressive. About the security guard on the second floor, who sang to himself very quietly at 3 in the morning, and had a voice that was surprisingly decent. Hadley listened. Then she started talking back. By the third visit, she was sitting up in bed without being reminded. By the fifth, she'd asked her morning nurse to adjust her therapy schedule so it didn't conflict with the hour between 6 and 7 when someone comes. The nurse had noted it without comment. The therapist had noted the improvement in Hadley's engagement without knowing what had prompted it. The progress reports said she was responding better to treatment. What the progress reports didn't say was that a janitor, with a night shift and a dead wife, and a daughter who slept with the light on, had simply decided to keep showing up because he understood, in a bone-deep way that no specialist training could replicate, that frightened children didn't need to be pushed toward courage. They needed someone who had been afraid themselves and come out the other side still standing. Corinne pushed the door open. It moved on well-oiled hinges without a sound. Brenner heard it anyway. She could tell from the way his shoulders shifted before he turned, and when he stood up from the chair, the first thing she noticed was that he moved the way people moved when they had spent years making themselves small in enclosed spaces. Controlled. Contained. Aware of where every exit was without looking for it. Ms. Ashcombe, his voice was even. No panic, no guilt. "Brenner Holt," she said. "Mom." Hadley sat up. Her voice had an edge to it, the particular sharp warning that meant, "Don't ruin this." Corinne looked at her daughter. The color was slightly better than yesterday. The posture was different, not the defeated curl she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Hadley's eyes were moving between them the way a child's eyes move when they're calculating whether the adults in the room are about to make everything worse. Corinne made herself breathe. "Step outside with me," she said to Brenner. It wasn't a question, Mom Hadley. Corinne kept her voice level. "I'll be right back." In the corridor, she turned to face him. He was taller than she'd realized from the security footage. Or maybe it was just that standing in person, she could see the way he held himself, the particular stillness of a man who had learned not to fidget in situations where fidgeting got people killed. "How long?" she said. "About 4 weeks. 4 weeks," she let that land. "You've been coming to see my daughter for 4 weeks without telling anyone." She didn't want me to tell anyone. He said it simply, without apology. I respected that. "She's 8 years old. You're an employee of my company."
You have no...
She stopped herself, because the speech she was about to make was the wrong one and she knew it. She'd heard Hadley laugh 20 minutes ago. She'd heard Hadley ask for water. She'd heard her daughter talk about plans, about wanting things, about the future which she hadn't heard in 4 months. "She was on the floor in the corridor crying," Brenner said quietly. I sat down. She talked. I came back the next morning because she seemed like she could use someone to talk to who wasn't being paid to talk to her. He paused. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like something HR would have serious concerns about." Probably. He didn't disagree. But I'm not going to pretend I'd do it differently. Corinne studied him. She was good at reading people. It was one of the actual skills she'd built her career on, not something she claimed as a personality trait. And what she was reading from Brenner Holt was someone telling her an uncomfortable truth without dressing it up. "Your resignation letter," she said. "Effective today." Why? Something moved across his face. Not quite hesitation. More like a decision being made about how much to say. "Personal reasons," he said. It was the first thing he'd told her that she was certain wasn't the whole truth. She filed it away, because Corinne Ashcombe had not built $11 billion in assets by accepting incomplete information, and she had not become the person she was by letting things go that her instincts told her mattered. She looked back through the door. Hadley was watching them through the gap, her expression somewhere between worried and defiant. "Go back inside," Corinne said to him. "Sit down. Finish whatever you were saying about the bird." Brenner looked at her steadily. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But she's smiling, and she hasn't done that in 4 months. So go finish the story." He went back in. Corinne heard Hadley's voice rise immediately. "What did she say?" and Brenner's quieter response, and then her daughter's skeptical, familiar laugh. Corinne stood alone in the corridor for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and called her head of HR. "I need everything you have on Brenner Holt," she said. "Employment history, references, background check, everything." "No, not an issue. I just need to understand who he is." She paused. "Because apparently he understands my daughter better than I do, and I want to know how." She ended the call and leaned against the wall with her arms crossed, listening to the sound of her daughter talking. The way she used to. The way Corinne had been afraid she might never hear again. The badge was still in Corinne's coat pocket. She hadn't decided yet what to do with it. The HR file on Brenner Holt arrived in Corinne's inbox at 7:48 that same morning, while she was still sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched and a board meeting she was going to be late for. She opened the file and read it twice. The employment history was thin in the way that certain people's histories were thin, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened, but because what had happened wasn't the kind of thing that showed up in standard databases. 3 years at Ashcombe Technology. Before that, 18 months of sporadic contract work logged through a security consulting firm out of Virginia that had a website with 3 pages and a phone number that went to voicemail. Before that, a gap of almost 2 years. And before that, 8 years of military service Navy honorably discharged. Rank of Petty Officer First Class. Specialization listed as Special Warfare Operator. That was the Navy's language for SEAL. Corinne set her coffee down. She had hired veterans before. Her company had a formal veterans hiring initiative, which her PR team was justifiably proud of. She understood in the abstract what that service represented. But understanding it in the abstract was different from sitting in a hospital cafeteria at 7 in the morning, trying to reconcile the quiet man in the discount jacket who talked to her daughter about birds with someone who had spent 8 years. Doing whatever it was that special operations personnel did in places that didn't appear in news reports. The personal notes in the file were sparse, separated. One child, daughter age 8, listed as emergency contact alongside a woman named Ruth Holt, his mother presumably given the shared last name. His wife was not listed anywhere, which meant HR had his records from after. After whatever had happened to her, Corinne closed the file and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then she called her assistant and told her to push the board meeting 90 minutes. There were things she needed to understand before she walked back into that room. She went back anyway. Not because she'd figured anything out she hadn't, but because Hadley's therapy session started at 8:30 and Corinne had learned, over 4 months of careful observation, that her daughter's mood going into therapy determined almost everything about how the session would go. A bad morning meant a closed-off session. A good morning was rarer and more valuable than any of the specialists seemed to appreciate. When she came back through the door, Brenner was standing near the window, and Hadley was in the middle of a story about something that had happened during a school assignment months ago, before everything. Brenner was listening with the same quality of attention Corinne had noticed earlier, not performative, not patient in the obvious way of someone waiting for their turn to speak, just genuinely there. He looked up when she came in. Something passed between them, not quite acknowledgement, not quite question, and he moved toward the door without being asked. "I'll let you two." "You don't have to go," Hadley said immediately. The edge was back in her voice. "Your mom's here," Brenner said. "That's more important." "It's not a competition," Hadley said, which landed harder than she probably intended it to, and Corinne absorbed the small impact of it the way she'd learned to absorb things lately by not showing she'd felt it. "He can stay," Corinne said. Hadley looked at her with open suspicion. "Really? Really?" Corinne sat in the second chair in the small one near the window that the nurses used and crossed her legs and tried to look like a person who was not conducting a silent assessment of every available piece of information in the room. "I want to hear the story about the school project." Hadley stared at her. "You do?" "I do." Her daughter's eyes moved to Brenner. He gave her a small shrug that said, "Don't look at me." And gradually, reluctantly, with the particular caution of a child who has been disappointed enough times to protect herself in advance, Hadley started talking again. Corinne listened. She also watched. She watched the way Hadley's posture shifted when she was speaking versus when the adults around her spoke. She watched how Hadley tracked Brenner's reactions. A small laugh from him would loosen something in her daughter's face, an almost invisible relaxation, like a fist slowly opening. She watched how Brenner never rushed the story, never redirected it, never let his eyes drop to a phone or drift to the window. He was entirely present. It was the simplest thing in the world and somehow the rarest. When the therapy aide came to collect Hadley at 8:25, Hadley went without her usual resistance. She complained about it, which was actually progress, because complaining meant she was engaging with the process rather than shutting it out entirely. "I hate the parallel bars," she told the aide. "I know," the aide said. "They should make them less parallel," Hadley said. "Like, mix it up." The aide laughed, and Hadley almost smiled, and they went down the corridor together, and Corinne watched until they turned the corner. Then she turned to Brenner. "Sit down," she said. "I should probably—" "Sit down, Brenner." He sat. "Tell me how she is," Corinne said. "Not the reports. Not what the therapists say. What you actually see." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, thinking quiet. She was beginning to recognize the difference. "She's not as far behind as the progress reports make it sound," he said finally. Corinne went very still. "Explain that." "I don't mean they're wrong about her physical recovery. The muscle weakness is real, the fatigue is real. But the reports keep describing her engagement as minimal." He paused. "Hadley's not minimally engaged. She's selectively engaged. She knows what she can handle, and she shuts down before she reaches the limit, which looks like resistance but is actually closer to self-management." He stopped, as if aware he was perhaps saying more than his position entitled him to. "That's just what I see. I could be wrong." "You're not," Corinne said. It came out more quietly than she intended, because she had suspected the same thing had felt it, even in the way she sometimes felt things about her daughter that no report confirmed, but she had deferred to the specialists because they had credentials, and she had guilt, and guilty people defer. She'd been doing it for 4 months. "The therapy team sees a child who won't push through discomfort," she said. "You see a child who's learned to pace herself. I see a kid who's been through a lot and is trying to stay in control of the one thing she can still control," he said, "which is how much she lets things hurt her." Corinne looked out the window. The city was fully awake now, traffic building on the street below, the ordinary machinery of a Monday morning grinding along indifferent to whatever was happening in room 14B. "How did you know to sit with her?" she asked. "That first morning. Most people would have called a nurse." He took a moment with that. "I have a daughter who went through something hard," he said. "I made a lot of mistakes early on. Tried to fix things that didn't need fixing, rushed things that needed time." He turned his hat, which she only now noticed he was holding in his hands between his fingers once. "Eventually, I figured out that what she actually needed was for someone to not leave the room. Everything else was secondary. How old was Maisie when her mother died?" The question was direct enough that it might have seemed intrusive. Brenner didn't flinch. 5, he said, almost 6.
"I'm sorry?"
"Yeah." The word was simple and complete. The way people said things when they'd said them enough times that the emotion had been processed down to its essential form. Corinne was quiet for a moment. "Hadley's father," she said, left when she was 2. He's not in the picture." She didn't know why she offered that. She didn't usually offer that to anyone, least of all employees. "I've tried to make up for it. I know that's not how it works." "No," he agreed. "It's not. You could be more diplomatic about that." The corner of his mouth moved. "Probably." She almost smiled. It surprised her. "Your resignation," she said. "I meant it," he said. The levity was gone. "I'm not taking it back. You haven't given me a real reason." "Personal," he said again. "That's not a reason. That's a category." She looked at him directly. "Hadley is making progress for the first time in 4 months, and you're walking out the door the same morning. I find out you've been the reason for it. I'm not asking as your employer. I'm asking because it doesn't make sense. And things that don't make sense usually have a reason that matters." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the hat in his hands. "Someone at the company found out about the visits," he said. Corinne's body went very quiet in the way it went quiet when she was about to receive information that was going to require her to make decisions she didn't want to make. "Who?" "I'd rather not who." He looked up. "Strain," he said. "Your COO." The name settled into the room like something dropped from a height. Victor Strain had been with her company for 6 years. He was 51 years old, efficient, and possessed of the particular brand of polished competence that made it excellent in front of investors and occasionally difficult to trust in private. Corinne had always been aware of the second quality and had managed it carefully because the first quality was too valuable to discard. He had never given her a specific reason to doubt him. "What did he say to you?" she asked. "He came to the building last Thursday, after hours." Brenner's voice was measured. He said he'd been made aware of an irregular pattern of behavior involving an employee and the CEO's minor child. He said if it continued, He'd have grounds to report it to the board, child services, and whoever else he felt warranted reporting to. He said the interpretation of an unauthorized adult forming a relationship with a billionaire's daughter could go in some very specific directions in the press. A pause. He was precise about it. Corinne didn't say anything for a moment. He threatened you, she said. He laid out a scenario. Brenner said carefully. He didn't threaten, he informed. That's the same thing when someone has more power than you. He didn't argue with that. And so you resigned, she said. A scandal doesn't hurt me the same way it hurts Hadley, he said. Or you. I've got less to lose and more flexibility. He said it the way he said most things flatly, without self-pity, as a simple calculation. It made sense. You made a unilateral decision about what was best for my family, Corinne said without telling me. Yes. That wasn't your call. No, he said, it probably wasn't. He didn't apologize, but he didn't defend it either. He just said it a concession without a qualifier, which was rarer than most people realized. She stood up. She needed to move. She went to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking down at the street. Victor Strain. She ran through it quickly, the way she always ran through things, not emotionally but architecturally, the way you look at a building to understand its structure. Victor had been pushing the overseas rehabilitation program for 3 months. He presented it initially as a medical recommendation, which had surprised her because it wasn't his area. He had a partner she couldn't remember the name. It was in a folder somewhere, who ran rehabilitation facilities in multiple countries. The investment proposal had been sitting on her secondary review pile because she hadn't been ready to make a decision about Hadley's care with a cold document. Victor had mentioned the proposal again 2 weeks ago. He had mentioned that Hadley's progress was concerning. He had mentioned it in the tone of someone who had an alternative to offer. He has a financial interest in a rehabilitation program, she said, to the window more than to Brenner. I don't know that, Brenner said. I do, she turned around. What I don't know is how much of what I've been told about Hadley's progress is accurate. She watched his face. You said the reports don't fully reflect what you see. How different are they? He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him weighing something. I'm not a doctor, he said. I'm not asking for a diagnosis. The reports I've seen, the ones the hospital sends to your office, I've only seen them because Hadley sometimes has copies in her room and asks me what words mean. They describe her physical capabilities as significantly more limited than what I see during our conversations. He stopped. She walked to the bathroom unassisted on Thursday morning. She didn't tell the nurses because she said they'd make a big deal out of it, and she wasn't ready for that. He paused again. The previous week's report listed her as requiring full assistance for ambulation. Corinne felt something cold move through her chest. Full assistance, she repeated. That's what it said. The room was very quiet except for the distant hospital sounds in the corridor. I want you to think carefully before you answer the next thing I ask you, she said. Okay. Do you think the reports are wrong because of sloppy record keeping, or do you think they're wrong because someone needs them to say something specific? Brenner held her gaze for a long moment. I think, he said slowly, that in my previous job I learned to notice when information had been shaped to lead someone toward a conclusion. I think the reports I've seen have that quality. He paused. I'm not certain, I could be wrong, but you asked. I did, she said, and I believed you the moment you said it, which is either excellent judgment or terrible instinct on my part. Probably some of both, he said. She sat back down. The weight of the morning was settling around her, not crushing, but substantial. The specific heaviness of understanding that a problem was larger than it had appeared, and that doing something about it was now unavoidable. You're not resigning, she said. Miss Ashcombe, you're not resigning, and I'm going to deal with Victor Strain. And if you have any additional information about those reports or anything else you have noticed that didn't sit right, I need you to tell me. She looked at him steadily. I understand why you made the choice you made. I don't agree with it. You have more standing in this situation than you're giving yourself credit for. Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprise. More like a recalibration. I'm a janitor, he said. You're a veteran and a single father who figured out how to reach my daughter when every credentialed specialist I hired couldn't. Don't undersell the position. She stood again. Stay away from Victor Strain. Don't tell him anything. Don't acknowledge that we've spoken. Can you do that? Yes, he said, without hesitation. Good. She picked up her bag. At the door she stopped. The overseas program. Has Hadley mentioned it to you? He was quiet a moment. She said her mother's boss keeps telling her mother that she needs to go somewhere far away for a long time. She said she doesn't want to. He paused. She said she's afraid if she goes away, she'll lose what little progress she's made. Corinne closed her eyes briefly. Her mother's boss, she said. That's how she described him. She didn't say anything else. She walked out into the corridor and stood there for a moment, with one hand on the wall, breathing steadily, the way she'd taught herself to breathe in the early years when the company was failing, and the investors were circling and she'd had to walk into rooms and pretend she wasn't afraid. Her daughter didn't want to go away. Her daughter was walking to the bathroom unassisted while her records said she couldn't. And the man who'd been quietly documenting both of these facts had tried to disappear to protect her family from a scandal that Victor Strain had manufactured as a threat. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and called her head of legal before the doors had finished closing. I need you to pull everything on the Meridian Rehabilitation Group, she said. Their corporate structure, their principles, their ownership, and anything connecting them to anyone on my executive team. Prioritize it. She paused. And get me an independent medical evaluator for a pediatric patient, not from the referral list Strain's office uses. Someone outside our usual network. She rode down in silence. By the time she reached the lobby, she had 3 more calls to make and a board meeting to not cancel. Because canceling the board meeting would tell Victor Strain that something had changed, and Corinne had not survived a decade in her industry by letting the people who moved against her know they'd been seen. She walked out into the cold morning air and nodded at her driver. The office, she said. In her coat pocket, her fingers found the smooth edge of Brenner's badge. She hadn't given it back yet. She'd been aware of it all morning like a small weight, which was strange because it was just a piece of plastic with a man's name on it. But it felt like something she wasn't ready to put down. She kept it there for the drive across town. Victor Strain was already in the office when she arrived. She could see his light on from the elevator, which meant he'd come in early, which meant he was either anxious or strategic or both. He had a habit of arriving before her during periods when he was managing something he didn't want her to look at too closely. She'd noticed it before and filed it away without fully understanding what she was filing. She understood now. Victor, she said, passing his open door without stopping, keeping her voice exactly as easy as it always was on a Monday morning. Good weekend, productive, he said. He looked up from his screen. You're in late. Hospital visit. She let that land naturally, the way it would have landed on any other day. Hadley had a good morning, actually. Best I've seen in a while. She watched his face. He was good, genuinely good, the kind of practice that took years, but there was something there. A fraction of a second where the professional warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. That's great news, he said, though these things can be inconsistent. You know how absolutely, she said. We'll see. Talk later about the Hendricks partnership numbers? Of course. She walked to her office, set her bag down, sat at her desk. 6 words on a folded piece of paper. A badge that meant a man had decided his absence was more to her family than his presence. She opened her laptop. She had an independent medical evaluator to arrange, a corporate structure to dissect, and a COO who thought he had this situation managed. He didn't yet know that the quietly perceptive man he'd tried to eliminate had already noticed the pattern in Hadley's records. Brenner hadn't said it in those words, but he didn't need to. He'd learned to read anomalies in environments where missing one could get people killed, and he'd brought that same attention to a hospital corridor and a little girl's progress reports, and a situation that most people would have walked past without a second thought. Victor Strain had looked at Brenner Holt and seen a janitor who could be scared off. He'd miscalculated in the specific way that certain men miscalculated by looking at a person's current circumstances and assuming that was the full measure of who they were. Corinne had made the same mistake for 3 years. She was not making it again. She picked up her phone and dialed. Outside her window, the city was loud and gray and indifferent, and 11 floors below, somewhere in the building's basement level, Brenner Holt's locker still had his name on it, and the badge she was holding fit the slot exactly. And none of the things that were about to happen had started yet. But they were close, the way storms were close before the pressure dropped, before the temperature changed, before everything that had been building quietly in the background finally ran out of room to stay hidden. The independent medical evaluation was scheduled for Wednesday. Corinne had arranged it through a pediatric rehabilitation specialist at a university hospital 40 miles outside the city, someone with no referral connection to Ashcombe Technology, no prior relationship with Victor Strain, and a reputation built entirely on published research rather than corporate consulting contracts. His name was Dr. Elliot Marsh, and he had agreed to come to Westbridge on short notice, because Corinne had asked him personally, and because the case notes she'd forwarded, carefully selected, had made him professionally curious. She hadn't told anyone in the company. Not her assistant, not legal, not the head of HR, who was still quietly pulling records on Meridian Rehabilitation Group. She had told one person, Brenner, because he needed to know that Wednesday morning's visit would look different than usual, and because she needed him to help Hadley understand that the new doctor was not another person arriving with a clipboard and an agenda. That conversation had happened Tuesday afternoon, briefly, in the hospital corridor, while Hadley was in her afternoon therapy session. She's going to ask why, Brenner said. Tell her I want a second opinion. Which is true. She'll know something's going on. She already knows something's going on. She's 8, not oblivious. Corinne kept her voice low. A nurse passed them, and she waited until the footsteps faded. I need her to cooperate with this evaluation. If she shuts down the way she shuts down with people she doesn't trust, the data is useless. Brenner was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to say to her? I want you to tell her the truth, that I asked for it. Because something in her reports didn't look right to me, and I want to make sure she's getting what she actually needs. She paused. Don't make it bigger than that. She's going to make it bigger than that on her own. Probably. But start with the truth and let her do what she does with it. He nodded slowly. There was something in his expression. She was still learning to read a kind of careful consideration that didn't telegraph itself the way most people's thought processes did. He didn't perform his thinking. He just arrived at conclusions and stated them, which was disconcerting until you realized you could trust that what he said was what he actually meant. I'll talk to her tonight, he said, after shift. Corinne looked at him. You're still working nights. You told me I wasn't resigning. I told you your resignation wasn't accepted. That's not quite the same thing. Close enough for practical purposes, he said. She didn't argue. Arguing with Brenner was like pressing against a wall, not because he was rigid, but because his positions were load-bearing, in ways that made dismantling them feel structurally unsound. She went back to the office and spent the evening in a meeting she barely heard, thinking about the number 47. 47 was the number of days between Victor Strain's first mention of the Meridian Rehabilitation Group and his threat to Brenner. 47 days of careful preparation, of building a case for the overseas program, of ensuring that Hadley's progress stayed minimal enough on paper to justify the recommendation, of waiting for the right pressure point. The legal team's report on Meridian had come back that afternoon. The corporate structure was layered in the particular way that corporate structures were layered when the people involved didn't want the connections to be obvious. 3 holding companies, 2 of them offshore, connecting back eventually to a principal investor whose name appeared on the founding documents of a wellness investment fund that Victor Strain had co-signed 11 years ago, before he'd joined Ashcombe. His name wasn't on Meridian. It didn't need to be. The money was. Corinne had looked at the organizational chart for a long time, tracing the lines with her finger, the way she used to trace circuit diagrams when she was learning hardware, before she understood that her real talent was for systems rather than components. Every node connected to every other node. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew where to look. Victor had spent 6 years building something inside her company. Not destroying it, he was too smart for that, but redirecting it, carefully, in ways that served the secondary investment structures he'd never disclosed. Hadley's rehabilitation was just the most recent instrument. A sick child whose progress could be controlled on paper, whose mother could be nudged toward an expensive overseas program, whose trajectory could be managed by the person who controlled the information flowing between the hospital and the executive suite. It was elegant, in the cold way that corruption was sometimes elegant, and it made Corinne's hands go still on her desks when the full shape of it became clear. She called legal back at 10:15 that night. How much of this is actionable, she asked. Enough, her head of legal said. The undisclosed financial interest alone is a significant breach of his fiduciary duty. If the medical records show evidence of deliberate manipulation, we're looking at something considerably more serious than an employment matter. I need everything documented before the board meeting on Friday, she said. A pause on the other end. That's tight, I know. Do it anyway. She hung up and sat in the empty office for a while. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did at 10. At night, glittering and indifferent. The particular combination of beauty and coldness that had made her feel both energized and lonely since the first year she'd had a corner office to look out of. She thought about what Brenner had said. She's afraid if she goes away, she'll lose what little progress she's made. Her daughter had been conducting her own private calculation from alone in a hospital room. She'd been managing her fear and her hope and her distrust of the system around her with the kind of self-protective intelligence that Corinne recognized, because it was the same intelligence she'd used herself at 8 years old in different circumstances, when the adults around her were making decisions that affected her and not consulting, and then being surprised when she pushed back. She hadn't connected those two things until right now. Herself at 8 and Hadley at 8. The specific loneliness of being a child who understood more than the adults around her believed. She turned off her office light and went home. The house was quiet in the particular way of houses that were too large for the people who lived in them. Corinne had bought it 5 years ago because it was the kind of house that said things about the person who lived there, and at 30 she'd still believed that saying things mattered more than she'd admit now. 4 bedrooms, 3 floors. A kitchen with an island she'd used to stack papers on because she didn't cook. Hadley's room was at the end of the upstairs hall. Corinne stood in the doorway for a moment, not going in, just standing there looking at the things her daughter had accumulated before the illness and hadn't touched since. A science project on the shelf. Books stacked sideways instead of upright the way Hadley always stacked them. A photo on the desk of the two of them at the beach 2 summers ago, Hadley laughing at something off camera, Corinne looking at Hadley with an expression she didn't entirely recognize on her own face. She went to bed and didn't sleep much. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, with rain that wasn't quite committing to being rain, just a fine mist that made everything look slightly out of focus. Brenner was already in room 14B when Corinne arrived, which meant he'd come from his night shift directly to the hospital again, which meant he'd done that every morning for the past 4 weeks, and she'd simply never known it. Hadley was sitting up in bed with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Mom says you told her something was wrong with my reports," she said to Brenner, before Corinne had fully closed the door. "I told her something looked off," Brenner said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "One means something's broken. The other means something doesn't match." Hadley considered this. "Which one is it?" "That's what the new doctor is here to figure out." Hadley turned to look at Corinne. Her eyes were doing the thing they'd started doing sometime in the past 4 months, not exactly guarded, but watchful in a way that made Corinne's chest ache in a way she'd given up, trying to not feel. "Are you going to send me away?" Hadley asked. "No," Corinne said. "Mr. Strain told you to send me away." The name in her daughter's mouth felt like a cold draft from an open window. Corinne kept her face still. "Who told you about that?" "Nobody told me. I heard him on the phone once when you were both here and you left to take a call." Hadley's fingers picked at the edge of her blanket. "He was talking to someone about a program in another country. He said it was the best option and that you were close to agreeing." A pause. "Were you?" "I was considering it," Corinne said carefully. "Were you going to ask me?" The question was direct enough that it landed before Corinne could prepare for it. She sat in the chair. Brenner had moved to the window without being asked, giving them space, and looked at her daughter. "I should have asked you," she said, "earlier than this." Hadley looked at her. The watching quality in her eyes shifted slightly, the way trust shifted when someone said the thing you'd been waiting to hear but hadn't expected. "Okay," Hadley said. "Not forgiveness, not relief. Just received." Dr. Marsh arrived at 9. He was 62 and somewhat rumpled in the way of academics, stopped caring about appearances sometime in their 50s, and he came with 2 colleagues, and a physical therapist, and a set of evaluation tools that took 20 minutes to set up. He introduced himself to Hadley as Elliot and asked her permission before he touched anything, which Corinne noted because most of the specialists who'd come through this room had not done that. Brenner waited outside during the evaluation. Corinne stayed. Hadley asked that they both stay, and Dr. Marsh had no objection to the man standing quietly by the window, who introduced himself simply as a family friend, and then said nothing further. The evaluation took an hour and 40 minutes. Corinne watched her daughter do things she had not seen her do in 4 months. Not everything Hadley's limitations were real and doctor. Marsh was careful not to push past them, but she walked the length of the room and back without assistance twice. She demonstrated grip strength in both hands that significantly exceeded the most recent report's baseline. She climbed 2 steps on the portable stair trainer that the physical therapist had brought, which the previous week's assessment had listed as not yet achievable. When it was over, Hadley was tired in the specific way of genuine physical effort rather than defeated fatigue. which was a distinction Corinne had learned to recognize over 4 months. She settled back against her pillow and closed her eyes. Dr. Marsh met Corinne and Brenner in the corridor. He didn't spend time on preamble. The discrepancy between what I just observed and the documentation you sent me is significant, he said. He had a folder in his hands. I want to be cautious about language here, because I haven't reviewed the full record history. But what I can tell you is that based on today's evaluation, this child's functional capacity is meaningfully ahead of where these reports place her. He tapped the folder. The kind of gap I'm seeing doesn't typically result from measurement error. It's too consistent and it moves in one direction. Corinne said, "What direction?" "Toward underperformance," he said. "Every metric in these reports understates what she can do. Some by a small margin. Several by a margin I'd describe as clinically implausible." He looked at her directly. "Someone has been reading her assessments in a way that produces a picture that doesn't match the patient." Brenner hadn't said anything. He was standing slightly back from the conversation, the way he stood back from most things present, but not crowding the space. Corinne glanced at him and saw that he was looking at the wall beside Dr. Marsh's head with an expression she recognized now, the careful stillness of a person who had already arrived at this conclusion and was listening to confirm it rather than to learn it. "I'm going to need your formal report," Corinne said to Dr. Marsh, "in writing with your methodology documented. Can you have it by Friday morning?" "Thursday evening," he said. "I'll make time." "Thank you." She shook his hand. "Please don't discuss this evaluation with anyone outside your immediate team until you hear from me." He nodded. He'd dealt with people like Corinne before, people who operated in environments where information was a tool and timing was everything, and he understood, without needing it spelled out, that she was in the middle of something that required discretion. When he'd gone, Corinne stood in the corridor and looked at the floor for a moment. "You already knew," she said to Brenner. "It wasn't an accusation. Just the recognition of a fact." "I suspected," he said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled despite everything. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true. Suspicion doesn't do anything. Evidence does." "We have evidence now," she said. "You have the beginning of evidence," he said, "which is different from enough." She looked at him. "What else do you need?" "Me?" He shook his head. "This is your territory, not mine. You know your company better than I do." "I know my company," she said. "But I've been running it with information that someone was managing. So my knowledge has holes in it that I haven't been able to see because the holes were designed to be invisible." She paused. "What did you notice?" "In the reports." "Specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. There was that quality again, the thinking that didn't perform itself. "The baseline assessments from the first 2 weeks were accurate," he said. "I compared them to what I've seen myself, and they track." She was that limited in the beginning. The inconsistency starts around week 5 of her stay. He glanced at the folder. Corinne was holding a copy of Dr. Marsh's materials. Week 5 is approximately when Strain first raised the overseas program with you. Corinne felt the cold move through her again. He needed her to stay limited, she said. Once she started improving, the justification for the program weakens. And once someone was sitting with her every morning who could observe what she could actually do and compare it to the reports, Brenner said, the justification gets more complicated, which is why he needed you gone. Yes. They stood there in the corridor for a moment with the weight of it. He's going to know something is happening, Corinne said. I've pulled records, I've commissioned a legal review, I've brought in an outside evaluator. He's not unintelligent. What does he do when he knows? She considered. He controls the information. He'd try to get ahead of it. Reframe the narrative before I can. She thought about the medical records, specifically the doctored assessments, the manipulated baselines. He'd try to eliminate the documentation. Or, Brenner said, reattribute it. She looked at him. He told me that continuing to visit Hadley could be interpreted as an attempt to gain access to your fortune, Brenner said. He said it in a way that suggested he had a version of events, already prepared. A story where I'm the problem. He said it without emotion, as a simple strategic observation. If the records get scrutinized, a story where I manipulated the evaluations, fed Hadley incorrect information about her progress, interfered with legitimate treatment, operated as an unauthorized actor, could be useful to someone who needs an alternative explanation. Corinne stared at him. He'd frame you for the record manipulation. It would be convenient, Brenner said. Unauthorized adult with unexplained access to the patient. Prior military background that could be characterized as either asset or liability, depending on who's doing the characterizing. No corporate standing, no institutional protection. A pause. And your initial instinct when you found out about my visits was to question my motives. He knows that because he has access to your HR communications. The realization arrived fully formed. The way realizations did when all the components had been accumulating below the surface. Victor Strain hadn't just threatened Brenner to remove him from Hadley's orbit. He'd been positioning him as a contingency, a fall figure with plausible enough presence in the situation to absorb the explanation if the fraud was exposed. He knew about you for weeks before he came to you, Corinne said. Almost certainly. He let it continue long enough that your presence in the records was established. Long enough that the story could work. She pressed her fingers to her temple. And then he came to you with the threat, knowing that you'd resign, knowing that your resignation would look like consciousness of guilt if it needed to. Brenner said nothing, because there was nothing to add. He'd worked it out already. She could tell from the absence of surprise in his expression when she said it aloud. He'd worked it out, she suspected, sometime before his resignation, and had made the calculation that removing himself was still the right move to protect Hadley from the mess. Had decided his own exposure was worth less than the conflict. You knew, she said, before you resigned. You understood that he'd set you up as a contingency. I thought I understood some of it, he said. Not all of it, and you still left. It seemed like the least complicated outcome for Hadley, he said. I was wrong about that, as it turns out. You were wrong about a few things, she said. Not harshly, just accurately. Yeah, he said, I was. She straightened. The decision-making part of her brain, the part that had been running contingencies since she'd read his resignation letter, Monday morning had arrived at a conclusion, and now it was a matter of execution. I need you to think back through everything you've observed, she said. Every visit, every conversation with Hadley about her therapy sessions, her progress, anything the nurses or therapists said in her presence that you heard, every detail that felt off. She looked at him. I need you to write it down. All of it. Tonight before the shift starts or after whenever you have time. Don't filter it. Write down what you saw and what you thought about what you saw and date it as accurately as you can. He looked at her steadily. You want a contemporaneous account. I want your testimony in a form that's dated and documented before anyone can suggest it was constructed in response to allegations. She held his gaze. Victor is going to move soon. He reads situations well, and this situation is changing. When he moves, I need everything in place. You're not going to warn him, Brenner said. In the board meeting. I'm going to invite him to attend a routine financial review on Friday morning, she said. He'll come, because not coming would be unusual. And I'll have Dr. Marcia's report, legal's documentation, and your account, and I will present all of it in front of the board before he understands what he's walked into. She paused. It's not elegant. It doesn't need to be elegant, he said. It needs to work. Something in his voice, the straight pragmatism of it, the absence of theater settled something in her that she hadn't realized was unsettled. It'll work, she said. She went back into Hadley's room. Her daughter was still resting, eyes half open, the particular drowsy alertness of someone hovering between sleep and wakefulness. Brenner came back in too, quietly, and returned to the chair by the window. Was he good? Hadley asked without opening her eyes all the way. The doctor. He was very good, Corinne said. Did I do okay? You did better than okay. Hadley made a small sound that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it. I walked the whole room, she said, both times. I saw I wasn't sure I could. I know, Corinne said. But you did anyway. Hadley opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. Brenner says that's what trying actually looks like, she said. Not being sure but doing it. He says people get that wrong a lot. They think trying means believing it's going to work. But really it just means doing it even when you don't know. Corinne looked at Brenner. He was looking out the window with the careful neutrality of a person who knew he was being quoted and wasn't going to either confirm or deny. He's right, Corinne said. He usually is, Hadley said. It's kind of annoying. I can hear you, Brenner said to the window. I know, Hadley said. Corinne sat with them for another hour. She had calls to return and documents to review and a strategy to finalize, but she stayed for an hour because her daughter was talking and her eyes were open, and the room felt different than it had felt in 4 months. And she was beginning to understand that the hour she spent here was not time taken away from the things that mattered, but was itself the thing that mattered. And she had been getting that backward for a long time. At 11:30, she stood to leave. Hadley reached out and took her hand briefly, the way children reached for things when they weren't quite ready to let go, and then released it. Will you come back tonight? Hadley asked. Yes, Corinne said. She meant it. In the corridor, she checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Victor Strain's office number. The first at 9:40, which was approximately the time, Doctor. Marsh would have been signing into the hospital's visitor log. The second at 10:15. The third at 11:05, increasingly insistent spacing that she recognized as the rhythm of a man who had noticed something he hadn't planned for. He knew, or suspected, which amounted to the same thing. She didn't return the calls. She called legal instead. Accelerate the timeline, she said. I need everything locked and documented by tomorrow night. And I need the board meeting confirmed for Friday at 8 a.m. Full attendance, mandatory. A pause. That's going to raise questions. Let it raise questions, she said. Strain will assume it's about the Hendricks acquisition. Let him prepare for that. It'll keep him occupied. She hung up and walked toward the elevator. The next 48 hours were going to be the kind of hours that determined things. She'd lived through enough of them to know how they felt the specific tension of a situation that had moved past the point where caution was sufficient and arrived at the point where you simply had to go forward and make sure the thing you'd built was strong enough to hold. She thought about Brenner's face when she'd told him the resignation wasn't accepted, the small recalibration she'd seen, the way a person looked when they'd resigned themselves to an outcome and were told, without fanfare, that it wasn't the outcome after all. She thought about what he'd done. Not heroically, that wasn't how it felt, and she was suspicious of heroism as a frame because it made people into monuments, and monuments didn't make mistakes, and this situation was full of mistakes. His, hers, Victor's, Hadley's, Doctor's. What Brenner had done was simply keep showing up, sit in a chair, come back the next morning, notice things that the people paid to notice them had stopped seeing. It wasn't heroism. It was something quieter and harder than that. It was the choice, made daily, to pay attention to the specific person in front of you when the world was giving you plenty of reasons not to. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. He'd made that choice about her daughter because something in him recognized something in Hadley. She understood that now. The specific recognition of someone who knew what it was to be, inside a hard thing with no clear end, who had sat with their own version of a hospital floor hallway and learned, slowly and with considerable cost, that the only way through it was to stay in the room. The doors closed. She pressed the lobby button and watched the floor numbers count down and thought about Friday, and what came after Friday, and the fact that her daughter had walked the length of the room twice this morning and said, I wasn't sure I could, and had done it anyway. On the 4th floor, the elevator stopped and Victor Strain stepped in. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and the particular expression he wore when he was managing his own reaction to something composed, professionally warm, the slight extra attentiveness of a man who wanted to seem as if everything was normal. He says, I've been trying to reach you. I saw, she said. I was with Hadley, of course. He pressed the lobby button, which was already lit. How is she? Better, Corinne said. Noticeably better, actually. I had a specialist in this morning for a second opinion. A beat. Barely perceptible. Oh, routine, she said easily. I just wanted confirmation that her current trajectory supports keeping her in her current program. She looked at the door, which it does, it turns out. So I think we can take the Meridian proposal off the table for now. Another beat. Longer. These things can shift quickly, Victor said. I'd hate to make a decision based on a single good morning. It wasn't a single good morning, Corinne said. And it wasn't a single evaluation. She kept her voice light, collegial. The voice she used in rooms where everything was fine and nothing had changed. But I appreciate the concern, I always do. The lobby arrived. She stepped out first. Friday at 8, she said, without looking back. Don't be late. She walked through the lobby and out into the cold air without checking whether he was watching. He was. She could feel it, the way you could feel certain kinds of attention. The quality of it was different from ordinary watching. It had an edge to it, the specific focused quality of a person recalculating. She got in her car. 48 hours. She'd been in tighter spaces than this. Not literally, not the way Brenner had been in tight spaces. The kind where the consequence of the wrong move was measured in something more immediate than legal exposure or corporate reputation. But in her own terms, in the terms of the world she'd built and defended for a decade, she'd been here before. She buckled her seatbelt. The difference was that this time it wasn't only her company at stake. It wasn't only her reputation or her investors or the $11 billion in assets that her name was attached to. It was her daughter. And the man who'd been quietly watching over her daughter while Corinne hadn't known to look, who'd tried to erase himself from the situation to keep the mess from touching either of them, who'd sat on a hospital floor at 6 in the morning with a crying child he didn't know, and said nothing and waited because he understood, in the specific way that only hard experience teaches, that sometimes the most important thing you could offer another person was your willingness to stay. She was not going to let Victor Strain take that from Hadley. She was not going to let Victor Strain take anything else from anyone in that hospital room. "Drive," she said. The car pulled away from the curb into the gray morning traffic toward everything that was coming. The 48 hours between Wednesday morning and Friday's board meeting were the kind of hours that left marks. Not visible ones, but the kind you felt in your shoulders and behind your eyes, and in the way you startled slightly when your phone buzzed with a number you weren't expecting. Corinne didn't sleep much on Wednesday night. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, with legal's documentations spread across the surface, not reading it anymore. She'd read it enough times to recite it, but needing it physical and present the way some people needed to see a map even when they already knew the route. The corporate chain connecting Victor to Meridian Rehabilitation Group. The financial disclosures he'd failed to file internally. The timeline of Hadley's manipulated assessments laid against the timeline of his investment communications. Dr. Marsh's preliminary findings, already in writing, already dated. Brenner's written account, which had arrived in her secure email at 11:15 Wednesday night, 4 pages. Single-spaced, organized chronologically, written in the spare and precise language of someone who had spent years filing operational reports and hadn't lost the habit. She'd read that document 3 times specifically. He'd noted dates, times, direct observations. What Hadley had said about her therapy sessions. What Hadley had demonstrated physically in his presence versus what the weekly assessments claimed. The specific language of 2 reports he'd seen in Hadley's room, he'd written the phrases down from memory, which was either remarkable recall or a habit of documentation, so ingrained he did it automatically. Probably both. At the bottom of the 4th page, after the last dated entry, he'd written a single additional paragraph that wasn't part of the timeline. It read, "I want to be clear that I don't have medical training, and everything above is observation, not clinical assessment. I also want to be clear that I have a personal interest in the situation, because I care about Hadley's well-being, and you should weigh my account with that in mind. I'm not a neutral party. I'm telling you what I saw because you asked and because it matters, but you should know who's telling you." She'd read that paragraph twice more than the rest. It was the specific honesty of someone who understood that credibility was built by acknowledging your own limitations before someone else did. It was also, she suspected, the specific honesty of someone who had spent years in situations where the cost of an inaccurate report was not a legal consequence but something considerably more permanent, and who had carried that standard into a context where most people wouldn't have bothered. She stacked the papers, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She lay there in the dark, thinking about the board meeting and about Hadley walking the length of her hospital room, and about the way Victor Strain had looked at her in the elevator, the careful recalculation happening behind his composed expression. The man who was very good at managing situations, understanding that this particular situation had moved outside his management. She thought about what came after Friday. She hadn't let herself think about it much, because the space after a hard thing was easier to navigate once you were actually in it, but she let herself look at it now, in the way you sometimes looked at a difficult landscape from a distance before you had to walk through it. There would be legal proceedings, probably extended ones. Victor's attorneys would be formidable and would look for every available seam in the case. The board would need managing. Not all of them would handle the revelation equally well, and a few of them had relationships with Victor that would make the next several months complicated. The press would find out. They always found out. The story of a COO manipulating a sick child's medical records to advance a business deal was the kind of story that traveled fast and landed hard, and Corinne would need to be in front of it before it ran ahead of her. And Hadley. She'd need to think carefully about what Hadley was told, and when and in what language. Her daughter was perceptive enough that protecting her from the broad shape of what had happened was probably impossible, but the specific details, the deliberate manipulation, the calculation involved those required care. She fell asleep eventually. Not long, but enough. Thursday passed in a controlled sprint. Legal. Compliance. A call with 2 board members she trusted completely, enough to brief them in advance without full detail, just enough to ensure that Friday morning wouldn't be chaos from the first moment. Her head of communications, brought in at 4 in the afternoon, who listened to a carefully scoped version of the situation and immediately began preparing language for the statement that would need to go out by Friday afternoon. Victor sent her 2 emails on Thursday. The first was about the Hendricks acquisition, which was Genuine's business and which she answered normally. The second was about the Meridian proposal, which he described as still worth considering as a long-term option, even if the immediate timeline was adjusted. The email was measured and professionally framed and contained, at its end, a sentence suggesting that she schedule time to discuss Hadley's overall care plan with him before making final decisions. She filed the email without responding. She went to the hospital Thursday evening and found Brenner already there, sitting in his chair, and Hadley in better spirits than she'd seen in months, not euphoric, not falsely bright, but genuinely present in the way of someone who was feeling slightly less like the world was happening to them, and slightly more like they had some say in it. She stood up without the bed rail today, Brenner said, when Corinne came in. Hadley looked at him. I said you could tell her, not announce it. That was announcing it? You did the voice. I don't have a voice. You have a voice, Hadley said. It's the one you use when you're trying not to sound proud of something. Brenner looked at Corinne. His expression was entirely neutral, except for something very faint and controlled around the eyes. I don't have a voice, he said again. You have a voice, Corinne agreed. He looked at the window. Hadley looked between them, and something moved across her face that Corinne recognized with a small start, the particular observant pleasure of a child who has noticed something adults think they're keeping to themselves. Corinne sat down. How did it feel, she asked, standing up. Hadley thought about it seriously, the way she took most physical questions seriously now, as if cataloging the experience rather than performing enthusiasm for the adults in the room. Wobbly, she said, but not as bad as last time. Last time it felt like my legs forgot what they were for. This time they were just slow. She looked at her hands. Like a computer that needs to restart. That's a good description, Corinne said. I know, a pause. Brenner says the legs don't forget. They just need reminding. He says a lot of things, Corinne said. Most of them turn out to be right, Hadley said, which is still annoying. From the window, still can hear you. Still no, Hadley said. Corinne stayed until Hadley fell asleep, which was earlier than usual the physical effort of the day, settling over her daughter in the visible way. Fatigue settled over children, not gradually but all at once, like a switch. She sat for a few minutes after, in the quiet of the room, watching Hadley sleep with one hand curled near her face the same way she'd slept since she was a toddler. She hadn't noticed that in a long time. She'd been so focused on the medical facts of her daughter, the assessments, the progress reports, the therapy schedules that she'd stopped seeing the ordinary details. The way she slept, the way she stacked her books sideways, the sound of her specific laugh when something actually surprised her into it. She'd been watching Hadley through the lens of what was wrong for so long that she'd nearly lost sight of who was there. Brenner was standing near the door, coat on, ready to leave for his shift. He waited while she gathered herself, without commentary, without the social pressure that most people exerted unconsciously in silences, the slight fidgeting that said wrap it up without saying it. Thank you, she said quietly, so as not to wake Hadley. For the document. It was thorough. I wanted it to be useful. It will be. She stood and pulled her coat on. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He nodded. You'll be all right. It was a simple thing to say, and he said it simply without the upward inflection that turned it into a question, or the deliberate firmness that would have made it a performance. Just a statement of his assessment, offered plainly. She found to her mild surprise that she believed him. Go to work, she said. He went. Friday arrived the way important mornings arrived unremarkably on the outside, with the same gray sky and the same traffic and the same coffee from the same place. All the ordinary surface of a day that wasn't going to be ordinary at all. Corinne was at her desk by 6:30. She reviewed the full presentation once more. Legal had prepared a clean, structured sequence, the Meridian corporate documentation first, establishing the financial conflict, then the timeline of Hadley's assessments against the timeline of Victor's investment communications and his internal advocacy for the overseas program. Then Dr. Marsh's evaluation report, with his credentials and methodology given full space, then Brenner's account, clearly identified as a first-hand observational record and appropriately framed for a board context. The security logs showing Victor's after-hours meeting with Brenner were included as a supporting document, time-stamped and authenticated. It was a complete picture. Not a dramatic one. Corinne had deliberately stripped anything that felt like theater, because theater invited the response of dismissing it as theater. What remained was data, sequence, and discrepancy, laid out in the cold and orderly way that boards responded to when they were being asked to make a serious decision. Victor arrived at 7:58. She heard him in the corridor, his voice, briefly, greeting someone, the familiar cadence of a man who was professionally comfortable in this building. She had spent 6 years listening to that voice in meeting rooms and phone calls, and the short conversations in elevator lobbies that weren't quite small talk. And she noticed now, with the clarity of Thursday's preparation behind her, how much of what she'd taken for ease was actually management. Victor Strain was always managing. She'd read it as competence. It was competence, just not directed where she'd believed. The board assembled by 8, 14 people around a table she knew the dimensions of without measuring. She had stood at the head of this table for 5 years, and she knew how it felt to begin something from, in this position, the specific responsibility of being the person with the most information in the room and the obligation to convey it in a way that didn't create more chaos than it resolved. She let the first 12 minutes go normally. Routine business, an acquisition update, a quarterly metric review. She watched Victor across the table. He was attentive and fluid and gave absolutely nothing away, which told her he was operating on high alert while showing her he wasn't. Then she said, "There's one additional item I need the board to address this morning. I'm going to ask legal to walk you through it, and I'll speak after." She nodded at her head of legal, who opened a folder. What followed was 45 minutes that Corinne would remember primarily in fragments afterward, not because her attention failed, but because her attention was divided between the presentation she already knew and the face of Victor Strain. The first 5 minutes, his expression was professionally attentive, the expression of a man hearing something that he expected to be able to address. Minutes 6 through 14, as the Meridian corporate chain became visible on the screens, and his name surfaced at the end of it via the investment fund documentation, the expression became more careful, not panicked, recalibrating. Minutes 15 through 27, as the assessment timeline was laid out, Hadley's manipulated progress reports cross-referenced against his communications and investment activity. Something shifted beneath the careful surface. Something that wasn't quite visible but changed the quality of his stillness, the way a change in air pressure changes a room before the weather breaks. At minute 28, he said, "I need to stop this." The room went quiet. "I appreciate the thoroughness," he said, and his voice was entirely even, which was either remarkable self-control or the response of someone who had a prepared counter, but I have serious concerns about the source of some of this material. Specifically, he looked directly at Corinne, the involvement of an unauthorized individual who has been operating in proximity to your daughter without any sanctioned role, and whose account of events appears to be presented here as credible testimony. He paused to let that settle. "Brenner Holt," he said, "a former night shift employee with an unexplained military background and no institutional standing, who developed an unsupervised relationship with an 8-year-old child in a medical facility. I raised concerns about this situation because I was genuinely concerned. And now those concerns have been reframed, using that same individual's account as evidence of misconduct on my part." He spread his hands, a careful, reasonable gesture. "I'd ask the board to consider who benefits from that framing." The room was quiet. Corinne could feel the weight of the question settling over certain board members, the ones who didn't know Victor well, who were hearing his version for the first time, who were doing the same quick calculation that Brenner had predicted they would do. She had prepared for this. "That's a fair point to raise," she said, "and I want to address it directly." She looked around the table, not at Victor. Brenner Holt's observational account is one piece of this presentation. It is corroborated by 3 independent sources. She held up one finger. Dr. Elliot Marsh, Director of Pediatric Rehabilitation at Carver University Hospital, who conducted a formal independent evaluation and found clinically significant discrepancies between the documented assessments and Hadley's actual functional capacity. 2 fingers. The financial documentation assembled by our legal team, sourced from corporate registration records, not from Brenner Holt's account. 3 fingers. And the security logs from this building, which document a meeting between Victor Strain and Brenner Holt on the evening of the date recorded, at which point Brenner Holt had not yet resigned and had committed no actionable conduct. She set her hand down. "Brenner Holt did not manipulate Hadley's records," she said. "He has no access to the hospital's documentation systems, no prior relationship with any medical personnel at Westbridge, and no financial connection to any party in this situation. The suggestion that he is responsible for the discrepancies in my daughter's assessments requires you to believe that a night janitor somehow corrupted the clinical documentation of a major hospital while simultaneously being the only person in the situation with no financial motive. She paused. The board can weigh that. Victor said, I'm not suggesting he manipulated records. I'm suggesting his account of events is motivated, and that the picture being constructed here is selective. Then let's talk about what isn't selective, Corinne said. Your name on the founding documents of a wellness investment fund with a 43% equity stake in Meridian Rehabilitation Group. Your failure to disclose that interest in your fiduciary capacity in 6 years of operating in that role. And the $11 million partnership proposal you have been advancing for 3 months to a company in which you hold an undisclosed financial interest on the basis of a sick child's progress reports that an independent specialist has now characterized as clinically implausible. The room was quiet. That's not selective, she said. That's documented. Victor looked at her across the table. For a moment, just a moment, the management fell away, and she saw the actual shape of what was happening behind his face. Not guilt exactly. Not the way people dramatized guilt. More like the specific expression of a man who had run a precise calculation for a long time and had now discovered that someone else had been running a different one alongside it, and that theirs was more complete. Then he looked at the board chair. I'd like an opportunity to respond to these allegations with my own counsel present, he said. That's your right, the board chair said. He was a 68-year-old man named Gerald Fitch, who had been through enough corporate crises in his career that his voice was entirely level. At this time, the board is going to take a recess. Victor, you'll be asked to wait in the secondary conference room. This meeting will reconvene at 11. Victor stood. He straightened his jacket, a small, reflexive gesture, the body maintaining its habits when the mind was occupied elsewhere. He looked at Corinne once more before he walked out. She didn't look away. The room emptied gradually, board members filing out in the specific low-voiced clusters that formed whenever something serious had happened, and people needed to process it in smaller groups. Gerald Fitch stayed behind. Well, he said. Yes, she said. The documentation is solid. It's solid. He nodded slowly. He'd been on the board for 9 years, and he'd seen her build the company from its difficult middle years. And she trusted him the way she trusted a small number of people, carefully and specifically, with clearly understood limits. You know this is going to be a significant process, he said. I know. The press communications is already prepared, she said. The statement goes out at 2 this afternoon, regardless of what happens at 11. I'd rather control the frame than chase it. Gerald looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had been in enough rooms with enough people to recognize when a person was running on will rather than ease. Are you all right? He asked. Not a corporate question. An actual one. She considered answering it honestly and decided to give it the honesty it deserved. Not entirely, she said. But I will be, he nodded. Go get some water, he said. 11's 2 hours away. She went to her office. She didn't get water. She stood at her window for a few minutes looking at the city below, and then she called Brenner. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear in the background the faint ambient sound of a quiet space, his apartment, probably. Sleeping hours for someone who'd just come off a night shift. It went in, she said. He tried the angle you predicted. It didn't work. A pause. Good. He's waiting with counsel for the 11 o'clock. I don't think there's a version of this he recovers from. The documentation is too complete. Are you okay? He asked. Not the professional version of the question. The same version Gerald had asked, but shorter, because Brenner didn't use words as padding. Getting there, she said. Hadley's morning session was good, he said. I stopped in before the shift ended. She asked the therapist to extend it by 15 minutes. A pause. She asked. The therapist didn't suggest it. Corinne closed her eyes for a moment. She asked, she said, yeah. She stood at the window with the phone against her ear, and the city going about its indifferent Friday business 42 floors below, and felt something ease in her chest that had been wound tight for months, not all of it, not everything, but enough that she could breathe at a different depth than she'd been breathing. Thank you for the document, she said. The last paragraph. A brief silence. I meant it. I know you did. She paused. That's why it mattered. She hung up and stayed at the window another minute. Then she went back to her desk and started preparing for 11 o'clock. The 11 o'clock meeting ran 90 minutes, Victor's counsel was a sharp attorney named Desmond Frey, who had a reputation for aggressive defense, and delivered on it he challenged the provenance of 3 of the financial documents, raised procedural objections to the manner in which the medical evaluation had been commissioned, and argued that the security log evidence was circumstantial relative to the interpretation Corinne's legal team had placed on it. He was good. Corinne's people were better, or more precisely, the documentation was better, because it had been assembled with exactly this challenge anticipated, and the weak points addressed before the room. By 12:40, the board had heard enough. Victor Strain was placed on immediate suspension, pending a full investigation. His access credentials were revoked before he reached the parking level. The Meridian Rehabilitation Group partnership proposal was formally withdrawn. The relevant financial documentation was turned over to the appropriate regulatory authorities by 2:15 that afternoon. Communications sent the statement at 2 as planned. Corinne read it once on her phone while sitting in her car in the parking structure, engine off. It was precise and appropriately scoped. It disclosed the conflict of interest and the suspension, referenced the independent medical findings without identifying Hadley by name, and committed the company to a full audit of all vendor relationships involving executive-level personnel. She had written the last paragraph herself and had argued to keep it when communications suggested trimming it. It read, "Ashcombe Technology is committed to ensuring that the well-being of employees and their families is protected at every level of this organization. In the coming months, we will be implementing a comprehensive review of our employee support structures to ensure that no worker facing a family crisis is ever placed in a position of choosing between their employment and the people who depend on them." It was not a legal statement. It was a commitment. She drove to the hospital. Hadley was in the middle of her afternoon therapy session when Corinne arrived. And for the first time in 4 months, Corinne watched through the window in the therapy room door without the sinking anxiety that had accompanied every previous observation. What she saw was her daughter, tired and slightly frustrated, because therapy was genuinely hard, and Hadley was constitutionally honest about difficulty but engaged, moving. Arguing with her physical therapist about the number of repetitions with the particular spirited stubbornness that Corinne recognized from before the illness, the version of Hadley who pushed back when she thought something was wrong rather than simply shutting down. The therapist looked up, saw Corinne through the window, and gave her a small nod that said, "This is new, and it's good." Corinne stood there until the session ended. Hadley came out in the transport chair she was still using for long corridor trips, and when she saw her mother, her expression did the complicated thing it had been doing for months, the mix of wanting and wariness that broke Corinne's heart in a very specific way because she'd put it there, and she knew it. "You're early," Hadley said. "I had a good morning," Corinne said. Hadley looked at her. "Did something happen?" "Some things happened, yes." She walked alongside the chair toward room 14B. "The short version is that some problems I've been working on got resolved. And one of the outcomes is that you are definitely not going to any overseas program." Hadley was quiet for a moment. "What was wrong with Mr. Strain?" Corinne looked at her. "What do you mean? You said problems, and you said overseas program. And Mr. Strain was the one who kept talking about the overseas program." Hadley looked at her steadily. "So what was wrong with him?" She was 8 years old and she'd been lying in a hospital room, observing adults for 4 months. Corinne supposed she should have expected this. He was making decisions that benefited himself instead of the people he was supposed to be helping, she said, which was true and simple and complete enough for an 8-year-old without being more than an 8-year-old needed to carry. Hadley processed this. "Is he gone?" "Yes." "Good," Hadley said, with the direct moral certainty of a child who hadn't yet learned to modulate judgment for social comfort. "Then is Brenner in trouble?" "No," Corinne said. "Brenner is not in trouble." "Good," Hadley said again, with equal certainty and zero qualification. They reached room 14B. The nurse helped Hadley transfer from the chair to the bed, and Hadley tolerated it with the particular pragmatic impatience she'd developed toward the physical assistance she still needed, accepting it without pretending to like it, which was its own kind of honesty. When the nurse had gone, Hadley looked at her mother. "Can Brenner still come in the mornings?" she asked. Corinne sat in the chair. "Yes," she said, "he can still come." "And you're not going to make it official or whatever? Like make him sign something?" "I don't think signing something is what makes it real," Corinne said. Hadley considered this. "That's actually pretty smart," she said. "For a business person. Thank you. I'm serious." "I know. That's why I said thank you." Corinne reached over, and straightened the corner of the blanket that had folded under itself. A small automatic gesture, something a mother did. "I'm gonna come in the morning sometimes too," she said. "Earlier than I have been, if that's all right." Hadley looked at her for a long moment. The wariness was still there. Underneath, Corinne wasn't fooling herself about that. Trust that had been worn down didn't rebuild in an afternoon. It rebuilt in the accumulation of ordinary kept promises, morning by morning, the same way Hadley's legs were being rebuilt slowly, with effort, with some days better than others, and some days that felt like going backward. But Hadley said, "Okay," one word. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the door held open. "Okay," Corinne said. She stayed until evening. She ate the dinner she'd had delivered from the place down the street that Hadley liked, the one with the good soup and the rolls that weren't quite as good as the soup, but that Hadley ate 3 of anyway. They talked about the science project Hadley wanted to eventually go back to, the one about water systems that is sitting on a shelf at home since the diagnosis. They talked about Maisie Hadley asked questions about her, with the careful interest of a child who was curious, but not yet ready to admit how curious, and Corinne answered what she knew, which wasn't much, but enough to prompt more questions, which was its own form of progress. When visiting hours ended and Corinne stood to leave, Hadley said, without looking up from the book she'd opened, "Mom, yeah? The thing you said about not choosing between work and the people who depend on you." She looked up. "Did you write that for the company or for yourself?" Corinne stood with her coat half on and looked at her daughter. "Both," she said. Hadley held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at her book. Corinne finished putting her coat on and went to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. It had been a long week, the kind of week that rearranged things. Not just the corporate situation, not just Victor's removal, or the legal proceedings, or the board, and the press statement, and all the machinery that would grind forward from here. Something else had rearranged, something that didn't have a corporate term for it. A recalibration of what she'd been paying attention to and what she'd been letting slide past her in the periphery, while she focused on the things that felt urgent and turned out to be, in the larger accounting, somewhat less important than she'd believed. The light in Hadley's room was warm and small against the hospital's fluorescent corridors. Her daughter's head was bent over a book. Her hair fell forward the same way it always had, the same way it had fallen forward since she was 3 years old and had decided she didn't want it cut anymore. Corinne looked at her for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she said goodnight quietly and went out into the corridor and walked toward the elevator. Her footsteps steady on the floor she had crossed 50-something times before, past the water fountain and the scuff mark on the baseboard, and the dispensers of orange-scented hand sanitizer. Tomorrow Brenner would come in at 6:15. Hadley would be awake already. They would talk about the bird and the birdhouse, and whatever had happened in the category of small ordinary things that accumulated, unremarkably, into something that turned out to matter more than the large ones. And Corinne would come earlier than she had before. That was the plan. Not a grand one. Not the kind that resolved everything in a single gesture. Just the daily kind, the kind you showed up for repeatedly, imperfectly, without guarantee of outcome, because the person at the other end of it was worth the showing up. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened, and she went home. The months that followed Victor Strain's removal were not clean or simple, because nothing real ever was. The regulatory investigation took 11 months to complete. Victor's legal team filed 4 separate motions challenging the documentation's admissibility, 2 of which had enough procedural merit to extend the timeline by weeks. His attorneys were expensive and thorough, and there were mornings when Corinne's own legal team called with updates that made her press her fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathe for a moment before responding. The press ran the story in waves the initial break, then the follow-up pieces when the investigation expanded, then the quieter analytical articles that arrived once the drama had faded, and journalists had time to look at what the situation actually represented about corporate governance and undisclosed conflicts of interest. Corinne handled it. Not gracefully, there was nothing graceful about managing a major public scandal while simultaneously running a company and visiting a hospital every morning before 7. She made mistakes. She gave one interview that she immediately recognized, watching it back, as too controlled and not human enough, which her communications team had gently tried to warn her about, and which she'd overridden because she'd been tired and certain and had turned out to be wrong. She snapped at people she shouldn't have snapped at. She missed 2 of Hadley's therapy sessions in a single week in March because of a crisis with a product launch that genuinely couldn't wait, and she felt the weight of those 2 missed mornings for longer than was probably productive. But she kept going back. That was the thing she held on to when the rest of it was difficult, the specific discipline of going back. To the hospital. To the chair beside her daughter's bed. To the conversations that were sometimes easy and sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally so ordinary that she would sit on the drive home and think about how ordinary they'd been and feel something she couldn't entirely name, but that was close to gratitude. Victor Strain was ultimately found liable for breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent misrepresentation. The financial penalty was substantial. His professional licenses in several relevant areas were suspended pending further proceedings. He never publicly acknowledged what he'd done with Hadley's records. Specifically, his attorneys framed it throughout as an error of judgment on the investment disclosure, not a deliberate manipulation of a child's medical documentation, but the independent assessment findings were part of the public record, and people who read carefully enough understood what they meant. Corinne never discussed the specific details of Hadley's records publicly. She'd made that decision early and held it. Hadley's illness and recovery were not corporate story material. They belonged to Hadley, and when Hadley was old enough to decide what she wanted to do with her own story, she could make that decision herself. What Corinne did discuss publicly, in a carefully considered speech she gave to her full company in April, 6 months after the board meeting, was the employee support initiative she'd announced in the press statement. The Ashcombe Family Continuity Program, Paid Family Crisis Leave, an internal fund for employees facing medical emergencies with dependents, a commitment that no worker at any level of her company would be terminated or penalized for taking time to manage a family health crisis, with a specific appeals process and an independent ombudsperson to oversee it. It was not a small initiative financially. Her CFO had spent 3 weeks building the cost models and had presented them to her with the particular careful expression of a person who had the numbers right and was uncertain how the person receiving them would respond. Corinne had looked at the numbers for a moment and said, "Approve it." Her CFO had said, "The full package?" "The full package," she'd said. She hadn't explained further. She didn't need to. The people in the room understood, or would, that this was not a PR response to a scandal. It was a recalibration, a recognition that she had built a company on the labor of people who had lives outside their employment, and that she had treated those lives as secondary for too long, partly out of the cultural assumption that a company's job was to compensate labor and leave everything else to the individual, and partly because she'd been doing the same thing in her personal life and hadn't noticed the connection until it was sitting in a hospital room telling her it walked to the bathroom without help and didn't want to lose the progress it had made. Brenner, when she told him about the program, said, "That's good." She'd said, "That's all you have?" He'd said, "What else is there?" "It's good. You did a good thing." She'd looked at him. "You could be more effusive." "I could," he said. "But you didn't do it for effusiveness." She hadn't. That was exactly right, which was one of the things about Brenner, that she was still. 9 months after finding his badge on her desk, adjusting to the way he said things that were exactly right, without wrapping them in anything. She'd known complicated men. She'd been in 2 relationships since Hadley's father left, both with men who were intelligent and interesting and ultimately exhausting in the specific way of people who performed their inner lives rather than lived them. Men whose feelings were always being narrated, always being positioned, always slightly too aware of how they appeared in the narrative of their own experience. She had eventually understood that she found this quality exhausting because it was a version of something she'd done herself. In her professional life, the constant management of perception, the careful curation of what was visible and what wasn't. Brenner didn't do that. His feelings weren't absent, they were actually quite present when you learned to read them, but they lived in what he did rather than in what he said about himself. He showed up. He came back. He noticed things and acted on them quietly, without announcement. He made mistakes and acknowledged them without theater and moved on. He was difficult to read until you learned the vocabulary of his particular kind of presence, and once you did, it was hard to go back to the noisier version. She was aware, and had been for some time, that she was not thinking about him the way she thought about an employee, or even a friend. She was also aware that the situation, the way they'd met, the thing he'd done for Hadley, the power differential that had existed and still partially existed, made anything she felt complicated in ways that required care. She had not said anything about it. She didn't think he had either, though she was less certain about that, because Brenner didn't announce things. What she knew was that he was at the hospital every morning. He wasn't needed somewhere more urgently, and that she was there every morning she could manage it, and that the hour between 6:30 and 7:30 had become something she planned her days around in a way she hadn't planned anything around in years. Not a meeting, not a product launch, not a financial deadline, a chair in a hospital room, and a conversations that was sometimes about Hadley, and sometimes about nothing in particular, and sometimes about things she hadn't talked to anyone else about. She didn't examine it too closely. She let it be what it was and trusted that it would become clearer in time, the way unclear things usually did, if you didn't force them. Hadley came home from the hospital in May. Not with no remaining needs, she still had outpatient therapy 3 times a week, and good days that were meaningfully better than bad days, and occasional nights that weren't great, and the ankle still required the soft brace for anything more than short distances. But she came home. She walked through the front door of the house that had felt too large for the two of them for years and said, looking around, "It's the same." "Were you expecting it to be different?" Corinne asked. "I don't know," Hadley said. "Hospitals feel so long. I thought maybe everything else would have changed." "Some things changed," Corinne said. Hadley looked at her. "Like what?" "Like the kitchen." Corinne had had the island cleared and a proper table put in its place, a real table, with chairs, the kind you ate at together rather than stood at while reading a tablet. "And your room." Hadley went upstairs. She came back down 10 minutes later with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was clearly not. "You found the science project stuff," she said. "I set it up on the desk," Corinne said. "You don't have to do anything with it until you're ready." "But I thought it should be out where you could see it." Hadley sat in one of the new kitchen chairs and put her chin in her hand. "The water systems project won't be accurate anymore," she said. "I started it 8 months ago. Some of the data is probably outdated. So update the data," Corinne said, a pause. "That would basically mean starting over." "Not from zero," Corinne said. "You already know what you're looking at. That's worth something." Hadley turned this over. The thinking expression on her face was exactly the same as it had been when she was 4 years old, and was being asked to decide something she wasn't sure about, a slight downward tilt of the head, a stillness around the eyes. Corinne had watched that expression for 8 years without fully appreciating how much she loved it, the specific quality of her daughter's mind working things out. "Okay," Hadley said finally. "I'll update the data." "Good. Can Maisie help?" she asked, as if it were casual. As if she hadn't been asking about Maisie with increasing frequency for the past 2 months, in a way that was transparently not casual at all. "You'll have to ask her," Corinne said. Hadley looked at her. "I don't know her very well yet." "I know. That's what asking is for." Hadley considered this with the same seriousness she applied to most things. What if she doesn't want to? Then she'll say so, and you'll figure out something else to do, and it won't be the end of anything. Corinne sat down across from her daughter. "But I don't think she'll say no." She was right. Maisie Holt did not say no. She arrived the following Saturday with a backpack, and the specific contained energy of a child who is trying very hard to be cool about something she was actually quite excited about. And she and Hadley spent 4 hours at the desk in Hadley's room, doing something that involved a lot of papers and a tablet. And at one point, a disagreement about whether a specific data source was reliable, that was audible from the hallway, and that Corinne listened to from outside the door with something close to joy. Brenner stood next to her in the hallway because he'd driven Maisie over and stayed, and they listened to their daughters argue productively about data quality. "Maisie's going to win that one," he said quietly. "Hadley won't accept that," Corinne said. "No," he agreed. "So they'll compromise on something neither of them actually wanted, and both of them will think it was their idea." Corinne looked at him. He was looking at the closed door with the expression she'd learned to read as contentment contained and quiet and entirely genuine. He had a coffee cup in one hand that he'd forgotten was there. She said, "Brenner." He looked at her. She said, "I'm glad you didn't stay gone." He was quiet for a moment. The hallway was narrow enough that they were standing closer than they might have in a larger space. And she was aware of that in the way she'd been increasingly aware of small physical proximities over the preceding months, without doing anything about it. "I'm glad you came to the hospital," he said. "That Monday morning." "I almost didn't," she said. "I told myself it was probably nothing. But you came anyway. I came anyway." He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention she'd noticed the very first morning, not performing interest, just present with it, the full weight of it on her, rather than distributed somewhere else. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't resign because I wanted to leave. I know, she said. I resigned because I couldn't figure out how to stay without it becoming a problem for you. I know that too. And I was probably wrong about that. You were definitely wrong about that, she said, as we've established. The corner of his mouth moved. Yeah. From behind the door, Maisie's voice, the EPA data is updated quarterly. That makes it more reliable than the state source, not less. Hadley's voice, the state source, is more specific to our region. Specific and accurate aren't the same thing. A pause. Then Hadley, fine. We use both and note the discrepancy. Maisie, that's actually the right call. Hadley, I know it is. I suggested it. Corinne and Brenner stood in the hallway in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have run out of the need to fill silences with noise. She didn't say anything else about what she meant. She didn't need to. Some things were clear enough without being stated, and this was one of them, and she had learned slowly, imperfectly, through 8 months of paying attention to someone who communicated mostly through action, that clarity didn't always require words. Sometimes it just required the willingness to stand still in the same space and not run from what was obvious. The months continued. Hadley's recovery was not linear. That was the part Corinne had eventually made peace with the non-linearity of it, the way a good week could be followed by a difficult one, without it meaning that the good week had been a mistake or that the difficult one erased it. She'd wanted the recovery to have the shape of a graph that went only upward, because upward-only graphs were something her professional life had trained her to expect from things that were working. Bodies didn't work that way. People didn't work that way. There was a week in July that was hard. Hadley had pushed too far in an outpatient session and set herself back, and the pain and frustration of it had pulled her into a 3-day withdrawal that reminded Corinne painfully of the worst periods in the hospital. She'd sat with Hadley through it, not solving it, not bringing specialists, not managing it from a distance, just sitting, staying in the room, learning in real time and with real cost what it actually meant to be present rather than productive. Brenner had told her, once, that the hardest thing about losing his wife had not been the grief itself. He'd expected the grief, in the vague way you expected things you hadn't experienced, but the discovery that his instinct to act, to fix, to solve, was useless against it. That the only thing that had worked was learning to stay in the same room with the thing that couldn't be fixed and not bolt from it. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when he'd said it. She understood it in her own terms, through her own experience, which was the only way that understanding actually worked. By September, Hadley was going to her outpatient sessions by herself, Corinne, or the housekeeper dropping her at the door. Hadley walking in alone, which had been Hadley's idea, and which Corinne had accepted after 2 days of quiet internal resistance. She was doing the science project again, genuinely this time, not as a rehabilitation exercise, but because she'd gotten interested in a specific question about municipal water systems that the project had raised and couldn't let it go. She was in occasional contact with 2 friends from before the illness, carefully and at her own pace, the friendship being rebuilt the way everything else was being rebuilt in small, consistent increments that didn't look like much from any individual day, but accumulated into something real over time. She was not back to where she'd been before the illness. Corinne had stopped expecting that, because before the illness was a different Hadley, younger, pre-everything that had happened, a child who hadn't yet learned what she was capable of enduring. The Hadley coming out the other side of this was someone different. Harder in some ways, softer in others, more careful about effort, and more honest about difficulty, and equipped with a specific kind of knowledge about her own limits and capabilities that most adults twice her age didn't have. Corinne thought, sometimes, that the illness had taken real things from her daughter. She didn't romanticize that. It had taken time and physical ease, and the simple, unself-conscious physicality of a healthy child, who doesn't think about what her body can do because it just does it. Those losses were real, and she didn't minimize them. But she had also watched Hadley, on a Saturday afternoon in August, show Maisie how to pace herself through something difficult, how to stop before the stopping point, how to rest without it, meaning surrender, with the authority of someone who had actually learned this from the inside. And she had sat in the kitchen and listened to her daughter teach someone else what she herself had only just learned, and she had thought, this is also real. This is also something that belongs to her now. It was not compensation for the cost. It was just true alongside the cost. Brenner understood this distinction without needing it explained. He'd lived his own version of it. The things that the loss of his wife had taken from him and from Maisie were real, and the things it had built in them were also real, and those two facts coexisted without canceling each other out, the way most true things did. This was, Corinne thought, the actual shape of a life that had been through something. Not recovery meaning the restoration of a prior condition. Recovery meaning the construction of a new one, from whatever materials remained, by people who were willing to keep building. She was 46 days into the fall quarter when Brenner told her about Second Harbor. He'd been thinking about it for months. He said longer than that. If he was honest, probably since the year after he left the Navy, when he'd spent the better part of a year understanding that the discipline and attention and specific capability he'd built over 8 years didn't have an obvious application in a civilian world that organized its val by credential and title, and the kind of experience that fit neatly onto a resume. He'd worked his way toward something, without knowing exactly what it was, through the janitor job and the night shifts and the mornings in the hospital room, toward the understanding that what he was actually good at the sustained, non-performative attention to people in difficult situations, the ability to sit with fear without amplifying it, the patience that came from having learned patience the hard way in environments that didn't offer gentler instruction had a use, just not a traditional one. Second Harbor was a mentorship and peer support program for children going through difficult periods, illness recovery, family disruption, loss paired with veterans and single parents who had navigated their own versions of hard things and come out the other side with something left over to offer. Not therapy, not case management, not an institutional program with quarterly outcome metrics, just people sitting with other people, showing up consistently, being in the same room with the hard thing and not running from it. He'd found a space, a community center in a neighborhood 40 minutes from where Corinne lived, that had a room available 3 afternoons a week and a director who was willing to host the program in exchange for the volunteer labor of some of Brenner's initial cohort helping with building maintenance. He had 8 veteran and single-parent volunteers committed. He had funding coming from 2 sources, his own savings, which were modest but intentional, accumulated over 3 years of night shifts with low expenses and a clear purpose, and a proposal he'd submitted to Corinne's company foundation, which was a real proposal going through the real foundation process, written with the careful precision of someone who had submitted operational reports for 8 years and knew how to make a case without overstating it. He'd submitted the proposal through the standard foundation portal without telling her. She'd found it in the foundation review queue on a Thursday afternoon when she was going through the week's submissions with her philanthropy director, and she'd recognized the address and the program description, and then, at the bottom of the contact information field, the name. She'd stared at it for a moment. Then she'd called him. "You submitted to the foundation," she said. "Yes. You didn't tell me." "It didn't seem right to tell you," he said. "It would either get approved because it deserves to, or it wouldn't. I didn't want the other thing." She understood the other thing. The concern that approval would come because of their relationship, rather than the program's merit that he'd be taking something instead of earning it. "It's a good proposal," she said. "I know," he said, which was not arrogance, just the plain assessment of someone who had put real work into it. "The foundation will run its process," she said. "I'm recusing from the review. I expected that. And if it comes back approved through the process, which it will. You don't know that." "I've read the proposal, Brenner." "I know." A pause. "Okay. When it comes back approved," she continued, "I want to be clear that the foundation investment is separate from anything else. It's not a gift. It's not charity. It has reporting requirements and outcome documentation and the standard accountability structure. I read the terms when I submitted," he said. "That's what I wanted." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you it's fine." Second Harbor received its foundation approval 6 weeks later, through the process, reviewed by people who didn't know Brenner Holt from any other applicant, and who approved it on the merits of the program design, the volunteer cohort qualifications, and the clarity of the outcome framework. The program opened on a Wednesday in late October. Corinne arrived at the community center at 4 in the afternoon. After her last meeting, with Hadley in the passenger seat, Hadley had asked to come, specifically, and had spent the drive over asking questions about the program that were really questions about what Brenner had built, and whether it looked the way he'd described it. The community center was a converted warehouse building with high ceilings and the particular smell of spaces that hosted a lot of different activity, floor wax and old coffee, and something that might have been the memory of a woodshop program. The room Second Harbor was using had been repainted recently. There were round tables and chairs arranged in clusters, and on one wall, Someone, Maisie, as it turned out, had painted a mural that covered the whole surface, a harbor, water, small boats, the suggestion of open water beyond. It was not technically perfect. Maisie was 9 and hadn't claimed otherwise, but it was vivid and honest and full of the kind of confident color that came from someone who painted because they meant it. Hadley stood in front of it for a long time. "She did this?" Hadley said. "Over 2 weekends," Brenner said, coming up beside them. He was in regular clothes, not a uniform of any kind, which struck Corinne as deliberate, in the same way his original proposal had been deliberate. He was building something that was his. He looked easy in a way she didn't often see relaxed without being distant, the particular quality of someone who was in the right place, doing the right thing, and knew it, without needing to announce it. "It's really good," Hadley said. "Tell her that," Brenner said. "She'll complain that the boat proportions are off, but she'll be pleased." Hadley looked around the room. There were other children already there, 6 of them, different ages, each one accompanied initially by a parent or guardian, all of them in various stages of the careful looking around that new spaces required. The volunteer mentors were distributed through the room, not assembled at a central point, not waiting to be introduced, just present and available, the same way a certain kind of person was simply there when you needed them, and not making a production of it. One of the volunteer mentors, a woman in her mid-40s, with a quiet way of moving that Corinne associated with people who'd been through something physically hard, was already sitting on the floor near the mural with a small boy of about 7, who was examining the boats with great seriousness. She wasn't talking to him. She was just sitting nearby, present, waiting for whatever he needed. Corinne watched that for a moment. There it was. The thing Brenner had offered Hadley on a hospital corridor floor at 5:48 in the morning. Not complicated, not credentialed, just someone choosing to stop moving and stay in the same space with another person who needed the company. The hardest thing to teach, the simplest thing to do, if you'd learned how. Maisie appeared from somewhere in the back of the room at a small run, which she converted to a studied walk when she noticed people were watching, and arrived next to Hadley with the slightly breathless energy of someone who had been doing something important and was briefly allowing themselves to stop. "Did you see the mural?" Maisie asked. "I was just looking at it," Hadley said. "The boats are good. The proportions are off on the middle one," Maisie said immediately. "Nobody's going to notice that except you." "I notice. So fix it next time," Hadley said. Maisie considered this. "I might," she said. "If there's space. Come on, I'll show you the supply room. It has the best stuff." She reached out and took Hadley's hand, not asking, just doing it, the easy physical directness of a child who hadn't yet second-guessed her affection, and pulled her toward the back of the room. Hadley went. Corinne stood and watched her daughter disappear through a door at the back of the room, hand in hand with a girl she'd met 4 months ago, through the particular chain of improbable events that had started with a badge on a desk and 6 words on a piece of paper. Brenner was standing next to her. "It's good," Corinne said. She meant the program. She also meant more than the program, and she thought he knew that. "It's a start," he said. "There's a lot to figure out. There always is." She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was coming through the high windows at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made the whole room look warmer than a converted warehouse room had any right to look. And Brenner was standing beside her, with his hands in his pockets, watching the room with the quiet attention he brought to most things. And she thought about the Monday morning she'd stood in his hospital corridor and told him to go back in and finish the story about the bird. She thought about the way she'd felt holding his badge in her coat pocket, the small, persistent weight of it, the thing she hadn't been ready to put down. She hadn't put it down, as it turned out. Not the badge specifically, but the thing it represented. The recognition that the person attached to it was someone she hadn't looked at and hadn't valued, and had passed in her own building for 3 years without seeing, because she'd been looking at the things that asked to be seen, the titles, the credentials, the performance of importance, and had missed what was actually there. She'd done that with more than Brenner. She'd done it with Hadley, with her own time, with the question of what the company she'd spent a decade building was actually for at the level of the people inside it, rather than the level of the financial architecture around them. These were not comfortable recognitions. She hadn't woken up one morning with sudden clarity and changed everything. It had happened the way real change happens slowly, at cost, with setbacks, in the accumulation of choices made imperfectly and made again. But she was different than she'd been on a Monday morning in January when she'd stood in a parking lot and told her driver to take her to a hospital she'd never expected to find a janitor's badge relevant to. "I want to ask you something," she said. Brenner looked at her. "Okay, when you resigned, the letter." She paused. "You wrote 6 words. Yes, why 6? He was quiet for a moment. In the room around them, the afternoon program was finding its rhythm voices, the sound of chairs, a child's laugh from somewhere near the mural, the ordinary sounds of people settling into a shared space. "I didn't know what else to say," he said. "I knew I had to go, and I knew I was sorry about it, and I didn't want to write a whole explanation that would make it harder than it already was." He paused. 6 words seemed honest, without being more than the situation deserved. She looked at him. "It was more than 6 words deserved," she said. "For the record." "I know that now. Good." She turned back to the room. "Don't do it again. Leave? Write 6 words when you mean considerably more." He was quiet for a moment. The quality of the quiet was the one she'd learned to read as something happening beneath the surface, the processing that didn't announce itself. "Okay," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a dramatic moment. It was 2 people standing in a repurposed warehouse while their daughters argued about a supply room, and 8 volunteers sat with 8 children, and the afternoon light came through high windows and everything that had accumulated between them. Over 11 months settled into its actual shape, which was quieter and more durable than anything she could have named at the beginning of it. She had spent her adult life in rooms where things were announced. Deals closed with handshakes and statements. Decisions formalized in documents and signatures. She'd learned to trust the formal version of things because the formal version was documented, and the documented version was real. She was learning, slowly, that some of the most real things didn't get documented. They just happened, in hospital corridors and community center rooms and kitchen tables, between people who had chosen, repeatedly and without guarantee, to stay in the same room with each other through the parts that weren't easy. That was the thing nobody told you about the life you ended up with versus the life you planned. The planned version was usually larger and cleaner and made more obvious sense. The actual version was specific and sometimes difficult and full of details you wouldn't have chosen in advance: a badge on a desk, a child on a hospital floor, a man who sat down 6 feet away and didn't say anything and waited, because he'd learned the hard way that waiting was sometimes the most valuable thing you had to offer. From the back room, Hadley's voice, indignant, "That is not how you label a folder." Maisie's voice, patient and not, "That's exactly how you label a folder." "Hadley, you put the date first." "Everyone knows you put the date first." "Maisie, I don't. Now I do." "So we compromised." "That's not what compromise means." "Maisie, it's what it means now." Brenner looked at the floor. Something moved across his face that he was clearly not going to name. Corinne said, "Don't." "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were thinking loudly. That's not a thing." "You do it all the time," she said. He looked at her. The contained thing around his eyes had gone somewhere warmer. The stopped quality of someone who had stopped managing an expression because the situation no longer required management. It was, she thought, the most unguarded she'd ever seen him, and it happened in a converted warehouse room with bad fluorescent lighting, and 2 9-year-olds arguing about folder labels in the background, which was not how she would have written it, but which was in fact exactly right. "Come on," she said. "They're going to need a tiebreaker, and neither of them is going to want to admit it." She walked toward the back room. After a moment, she heard him follow. The 4 of them sat around a supply room table for 20 minutes, working out a folder labeling system that satisfied nobody completely and worked well enough for practical purposes, which was probably the definition of most arrangements that actually held together. Maisie drew a diagram. Hadley revised the diagram. Brenner pointed out that the diagram had accidentally made things more complicated and was told by both girls simultaneously that he was missing the point. He looked at Corinne across the table. She looked back. There would be more hard things. She knew that the same way she knew everything she knew, from evidence, from pattern, from the reasonable projection of past experience onto future probability. There would be more difficult months with Hadley. More nights when the company needed more than she had available. More moments when the distance between what she wanted to give and what she had the capacity to give felt like a failure she couldn't close. There would be disagreements with Brenner because 2 people who were each difficult in their own specific ways and who had both spent years operating largely alone did not merge their lives smoothly. And the idea that they would was the romantic version, which she had stopped believing in some time before January, and whose absence she did not mourn. What there would also be, a dinner table that had people at it. A daughter who walked into rooms under her own power and argued about folders and painted murals and taught other children what she'd learned in a hospital room about the difference between stopping and giving up. A man who sat down next to frightened people and waited, who showed up without announcement, who had tried to disappear to protect her family and been wrong about that in the specific way that good people were sometimes wrong, by undervaluing what their presence meant to the people who had learned to count on it. What there would also be, Corinne arriving home after long days and finding lights on. Dinner happening. The ordinary sounds of a house that was not too large for the people living in it. She had built an empire from the accurate understanding that information was power. She still believed that. But she had added something to the equation that she hadn't had 11 months ago. The understanding that the most important information was not always in the reports. Sometimes it was in the thing you almost walked past. The corridor at 5:48 in the morning. The 6 words on the folded paper. The child sitting on the floor who didn't need to be fixed, only accompanied. You could spend a lifetime building structures to carry weight and miss the moment a person simply sat down next to someone and refused to leave. She was not going to miss it again. Outside the supply room, through the wall, the afternoon program continued its first imperfect, necessary afternoon. 8 children, and 8 people who had learned something about difficulty and were choosing to offer it. The mural on the wall, boats and water, and the suggestion of open harbor beyond. Maisie's proportional errors and her unqualified color, and the hours she'd put in across 2 weekends because she'd wanted the room to look like somewhere you might want to stay. It did look like that. It looked exactly like that.